It's a clash of titans at the Tal Memorial. Fabiano Caruana with the white pieces, taking on the world champion Magnus Carlsen. This is Blitz chess at its absolute best. Caruana opens with e4, and we have a Sicilian defense from Magnus. White goes for the Rossolimo variation with bishop b5, and both sides develop their knights. And here, Magnus plays pawn to e5. A slight inaccuracy. This gives Caruana a real chance to grab an advantage by taking on c6, which would win him a clean pawn. But Caruana misses it. He had a golden opportunity to punish that e5 push. The winning idea was to strike immediately. Bishop takes the knight on c6, shattering black's pawn structure. Then, knight grabs the pawn on e5. After bishop to d6, knight to f3 simply consolidates, winning a pawn. But in the game, Fabi simply castles kingside, and the chance evaporates. The game is back to equal. The game continues with standard development. Black shores up the center, and Caruana puts a pin on the knight with bishop to g5. And Magnus just castles kingside, a brilliant move. He's willing to sacrifice a pawn to open up lines for his pieces and start a queenside pawn storm. A very dynamic decision. Caruana takes on f6, giving Magnus the bishop pair. A knight hops into d5, but black's bishop meets it on e6, keeping things solid. A quiet period of maneuvering now. Both sides tuck their kings away and get their pieces onto better squares, preparing for the inevitable middle-game clash. And the action begins. Caruana expands on the queen side with b4, and Magnus immediately strikes back on the king side, pushing his f-pawn. Magnus plays pawn to b6, and that's another slip. This creates a target, and white can now win a pawn by simply taking on b6. But for the second time, Caruana misses the tactical shot. He had a clear path to an advantage. The correct sequence was, knight takes the pawn on b6, and after the recapture, bishop takes bishop on e6, forces a trade. Black gets a pawn back on a3, but after pawn takes on c5, white is simply up material. Back in the real game, Caruana plays knight to e3 instead, and just like that, Magnus is right back in it. The middle game gets incredibly tense. Pieces are flying around the board, and Magnus continues his kingside assault by pushing the f-pawn all the way to f4. Now it's white's turn to make a misstep, handing the initiative over to black. The stronger plan was to push on the queen side. Pawn to b5, and after knight to d8, queen to a4 keeps the pressure on. Black defends with rook to c7, and h3 maintains white's control. But instead, Caruana plays knight to d2, a passive move that allows black to seize a significant advantage. But Magnus misses his chance. Instead of striking on the queen side with b5, he plays pawn to g5, which is a bit too slow and lets white back into the game. Caruana immediately plays pawn to f3, putting a stop to black's kingside ambitions, and now, pawn to g4 from Magnus. This looks aggressive, but it's another inaccuracy that gives away almost all of his remaining advantage. The position is nearly equal again. White simply captures the pawn on g4, and black recaptures with bishop takes g4, but this is yet another slip. Trading pawns on the queen side first was much stronger, winning a pawn. Now white actually has a small edge. The knight comes to f3, and the bishop drops back to f6. The pieces are finding new homes after that kingside scuffle. This roller coaster game continues. White had a slight advantage, but now lets it go. The best path was to clarify the queen side. Pawn takes on c5, and after the recapture, pawn to a4 applies pressure. Black defends with queen to g7, and king to h1 keeps white's king safe and maintains the edge. But in the game, Caruana plays rook to b2, and once again, the position is roughly equal. Now we see a flurry of moves on the queen side. Both players are maneuvering their pieces and pawns, trying to create an advantage in the pawn structure. And another slight mistake from black, who misses the most precise continuation. Stronger was to resolve the pawn tension immediately. Pawn takes on b4, and after the recapture, knight to c7 repositions the knight. After bishop to b7, bishop to e6 holds everything together. Instead, Magnus plays pawn to a6, which allows white to get a slight edge once more, and Caruana uncorks a brilliant move. Pawn to h3. This is a fantastic pawn sacrifice designed to eliminate the powerful f6 bishop, which is a key defender of the black king. Magnus has to accept the sacrifice, taking on f3. After the recapture, black's knight leaps into g5, looking for counterplay. A series of trades follows. The knights come off the board, the queenside pawns are exchanged, and black's rook finds a very active post on c5. The tension is palpable. The queen shuffles to a3, the bishop comes to h4, and both sides are positioning their pieces for the decisive attack. White takes the pawn on b5, clarifying the queen side. And that's a serious mistake from Magnus. He had a simple recapture that was best. He should have just taken back on b5. Pawn takes b5, and after pawn to a6, pawn to b4 keeps the balance. The queen takes, and rook to c1 check creates problems for white. But in the game, Magnus plays rook to c2, and this should have been a winning opportunity for Caruana. Unbelievable. Caruana misses the killing blow. He had a move that would have secured a winning position. The decisive idea was pawn to b6, and after queen to g7, the g4 push suffocates black's king. After h5, bishop to e6 consolidates a winning advantage for white. Instead of that, he plays pawn takes pawn on a6, a move that allows black a stunning tactical shot, winning a pawn. But Magnus misses it too. The players are under immense pressure. There was a beautiful tactic here for black. The winning line was rook takes the pawn on g2 with check. The king is forced to recapture. Queen to c2, check, the king moves to g1, and queen takes the rook on b1 with check, winning a pawn. But back in the game, Magnus plays rook to f6, and the advantage swings decisively back to white. What a sequence. Caruana now has a commanding position. His queen comes to b4, and black's queen retreats to g7 to defend. White plays queen to b8 with check, but this is an inaccuracy. It allows black to trade pieces and get into an endgame that's much easier to hold. But Magnus responds with rook to f8, which is also a mistake. This gives white the chance to force a queen trade and create a monster-passed pawn on the a file. And Caruana finds it. Queen takes the rook on f8. Check. A brilliant queen sacrifice. The point is to force the queens off the board and create a winning endgame with that unstoppable a pawn. Magnus has no choice but to play queen takes queen on f8. It's the only move, but it's a great one, finding the best possible defense in a desperate situation. And Caruana correctly pushes pawn to a7, again the only winning move. The race is on. That pawn is just one square away from becoming a new queen. Black's rook gets to c8 to blockade the pawn, and now it's a desperate fight. White pushes in the center, trying to create another threat, and here comes the final, shocking twist of the game. Caruana is completely winning, but he makes a catastrophic blunder. The simple winning move was to get the rook behind the pawn, rook to b8, and after black takes the pawn on a7, rook takes rook on c8 is check. The king moves to g7, and rook to f1 secures the win, as white is up a piece. But in a stunning moment, Caruana plays rook to b7, and this move doesn't just lose the advantage, it allows a forced checkmate, and Magnus instantly pounces rook to c1 check. A fantastic move, the only one, and the start of a beautiful forced mating combination. Caruana is forced to block with rook to f1, and now bishop to f2, check, a stunning, brilliant sacrifice. This move rips open the white king's position and forces him into a deadly mating net. There's nothing to be done. King takes the bishop on f2, and the final blow, rook to c2, check, it's all over. Caruana resigned here as checkmate is unstoppable in just 3 moves. What a game, and black wins. A complete roller coaster of blunders and brilliancies, and in the end, Magnus Carlsen snatches victory from the jaws of defeat. White resigned because the coming checkmate is unstoppable. Here's what he saw. The king is forced to e1, queen to g3, check. The king is dragged out to d1, queen to d3, another check. And after the king moves back to e1, mate is just one move away.